Good evening. Last night, a very serious subject came into our class. With the thought that there are no material powers, no material solutions to the problems of the world. In past generations, it was always possible to seek for a larger power than was known, just as we used gunfire and machine guns, large cannon, and finally airplane bombs, and eventually atomic bombs. And each time that a country discovered a bigger power, they were able to defeat all the countries that had not such great power. But now we have come to a place in history where not only there may be no greater powers to discover than we already have, but even if there are greater powers, we can't use them because they destroy those who use them as well as those that they use them against. And so no one today dare use even the powers that we already have. And so if we are not to have power to bring about peace, harmony, or abundance, how are we to solve the problems of today? There is no way in the human scale, because the only power that has been known to mankind for 5,000 years to solve its problems has been wars. Nobody in 5,000 years has ever discovered anything new. Every major problem in the last 5,000 years has been settled with a war. And of course nobody ever dreamed of any other power, because it has been demonstrated that you cannot even make agreements that are binding on anyone. There have been international agreements among nations for hundreds and hundreds of years. No nation has ever lived up to one of those agreements any longer than it suited their convenience. When it no longer suited their convenience, it became a scrap of paper and it was destroyed. And so it is foolish to believe that all of a sudden we are going to solve the world's problems by agreements, because we aren't. It makes no difference who signs the agreements. Their word is no good. And it makes no difference who it may be. Their word is no good. Only as long as it suits their convenience for it to be good. And with the world in the state of commercial development that it is today, all wars would be commercial wars. All wars would take place because of economics. And so, since the reason for wars are becoming more acute than ever before, and because we can't use wars anymore, because of the tremendousness of the powers that are involved, we are at a stalemate in the human scene. We are at a position where we cannot go forward and we cannot go backward, and we cannot solve a problem by any means now known. And this means that unless a whole new principle is discovered, a whole new principle of solving national and international problems is discovered, that the world will just stumble forward into destruction. It really makes no difference whether the destruction is from bombs, or whether the destruction is from being taken over by a new form of slavery, or even if the world should be taken over by organized ignorance. The effect would be disastrous to the world, and every thinking person should search the papers, the magazines, the speeches of those in high public office, and see if they can find one shred of hope that any one of these high officials or men in high places of leadership have one single contribution to make to the world. And you will soon discover they are not even promising a solution. Not even promising. And that is something new in the world's history, because heretofore men in high places always promised, at least, that if they were in office or could get in office, that they had a solution, but none of them now even claims to have a solution. And so it is that everyone needs to ask themselves, if there is no human solution, does that mean that there is no solution? And they will soon discover, if they are on this spiritual path, that it does not mean that at all. We have witnessed in this work, you have witnessed, some of you in your experience, that when there were conditions in your life insurmountable by human means, that you have discovered a spiritual means with which to meet the situation. It may have been a disease, it may have been some form of lack or limitation, some form of unhappiness, but when you came to a place in your experience where there was no more material means to look to, when there was no human solution to your particular problem, I'm sure that most of you have discovered that there is a spiritual solution, and it has brought forth harmony where no human or material solution to the problem was evident. That is the history of surely several millions of families who have turned to metaphysical and spiritual teachings and found the solution to their problems, a solution which could not otherwise be found. And now that the world is crying out for a solution to national and international problems, and in many ways discovering that there are no human solutions, the question must arise in your thought as to whether or not there isn't a spiritual solution. Now, in the States, this has been so apparent for the last 10 years. The public have been so convinced that there is no human solution that they are filling the churches over there. Churches are no longer empty in the States or half filled. They are crowded. Churches of all denominations are crowded. More than 50% of the population is voluntarily going to church regularly. Now, of course, the church offers no solution, and it has no spiritual power to offer. And people are going there not because there is a solution there, but because there is a conviction that there is no human solution, and they hope to find the solution in their churches. Now, there must be groups of people on the face of the earth who have risen above sectarianism, denominationalism, even above nationalism, even above the nonsensical belief of my country, right or wrong, my country. There must be people who think in terms of God as the one Father and of all men as constituting a brotherhood, and who are willing to rise above the differences of human experience and let themselves be instruments for God's power, God's presence, to be made evident on earth. Our particular function is in our work of the infinite way, is the attaining of God realization, the attaining of conscious union with God. In case you ask, for what purpose? The answer is this. And I ask you now to hear this very clearly, to understand it. This room in which we are seated is a room. It has walls and a ceiling and a floor, but it has no feelings, it has no emotion. It's just a room. If we who are gathered here now are to experience experience love, it can only come through your individual and collective consciousness and in no other way. If this room is to be a temple of God, if it is to be a house of love, it can't be that by virtue of its walls or ceiling or floor. It can only be that by virtue of your consciousness. If you admit love into this room through your consciousness, we will all feel it. And love will be a power. Now, if you or I withhold love from our consciousness by indulging hate, jealousy, animosity, competition, greed, anger, lust, injustice, unkindness, gossip, rumor. If we indulge those things, love has no inlet into this room. Love can only come into this room through a consciousness that is devoid of all of those negative emotions and qualities I have just named. In other words, we must be able to sit here saying, I want nothing that you have. I know that you want nothing that I have. Therefore, just let us sit here and let God enter this room and have his way. Now, behind all of this is a truth that has been withheld from the world for more centuries than we can count. And that is this: in spite of God's omnipresence, there is no God in this room until we, through our consciousness, admit God here. In other words, God is not a blank. God is not an empty space. God is an activity and a substance of consciousness, and can only be expressed through consciousness. In other words, let us assume for a moment that Jesus Christ is on earth, and we have discovered that he is somewhere within 1,000 miles of here. How quickly do you think we would all be making arrangements to go where he is and to sit in his presence? Overnight we would be begging, borrowing, and maybe stealing the money to get there. Why? Because we would know that wherever he is, the presence of God, the presence of love, is being made manifest. But if God is everywhere, why do we have to go where he is? Why can't we stay some other place and find God? We can, if we know somebody else who is willing to be an instrument through which God flows, because God is no respecter of persons. But the point is, you cannot find God except where you can find an individual willing to let God through. God is kept out of the world by human consciousness, and that is why you can have murders, robberies, rapes, arson, all the crimes in the calendar, dictators, tyrants, cruelties, poverty. Why can you have this? Because where there is only human consciousness, God cannot enter the world to change those conditions. And it is only where there are individuals willing to let God through. But you say, aren't all men willing to let God through? No. Most men and most women will not give up their personal animosities or jealousies or rivalries or greeds or lusts to let God through. They will not give forgiveness to the sinners. It is so much easier to be self-righteous and to be holier than thou and to feel kind of holy while doing it. It is so difficult to say to the woman taken in adultery, neither do I condemn thee. It is so difficult to say to the thief on the cross, I will take you with me into paradise this very night. It is so difficult to pray for our enemies, Father, open their eyes and forgive them. They know not what they do. And so humanity would rather hold on to those thoughts of revenge, vindictiveness, judgment, criticism, condemnation, and thereby blot out God. Because the way is straight and narrow. No individual can be an instrument through which God reaches the earth unless they are willing to live without the personal sense. The personal sense that gloats or is happy in the sinner's punishment rather than being happy in the sinner's forgiveness. The average person is far too much concerned with their supply rather than being concerned with a neighbor's supply. This is not only true individually, this is true collectively, this is true nationally. I served on a committee for many, many years called the Friends of China that tried to get our own government to send the food to China that we were sending out into the ocean to be thrown overboard, and couldn't ever succeed. Couldn't succeed. No, it was better to throw it overboard than pay the expense to ship it to China, where people were starving. This is not only an individual thing, this is a collective emotion that keeps God out of this universe. For God can only enter through love. And there's only two kinds of love that admits God. It isn't the love that you have for your children. That doesn't admit God anywhere. It isn't the love you have for husband or wife or parent. That doesn't admit God anywhere. That's all personal. There are only two kinds of love that admits God into this world. That is loving God supremely and loving thy neighbor as thyself. All other forms of love, even the kind of love that's willing to go out and die for the flag, is selfish love, is personal love. There's no relationship to God love. Yes, if we were equally willing to die for our enemy's country, that might be different. If we were equally willing to die for our enemy, that might be different. God is love. Let no one misunderstand that. But the Master made it very clear that he wasn't talking about loving his mother or his brother or his sister. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul, and thy neighbor as thyself. And thou shalt pray not for your friends, it profiteth you nothing, but pray for your enemies, that ye may be the children of God. And so you see, there is a way not only to end the possibility of a hot war, but to stop this cold war too. That way is love. The love of God and the love of a neighbor, which would enable us to be so free of judgment, condemnation, criticism, in the realization that whatever wrongs are being committed on earth or were committed on earth are only being committed because of stupidity. They know not what they do. That means stupidity, ignorance, dumbness. They know not what they do. Therefore, Father, let's forgive them, and while we're forgiving them, let us open our consciousness and admit God into this world. And this is one way to start it. You start with this room, and then you branch out. Well, let's start with this room. Let each one of us here realize now I am not seeking anything of anyone in this room. I am here only for one purpose, seeking the realization of God, seeking an understanding of truth, seeking an awareness of God's presence, seeking to know God aright. I am here for only one purpose, that God may use me, that God may flow through me. If possible, heal my neighbor. If possible, forgive my neighbor. Not me, but the God power flowing through me. That the presence of God in me may heal those around me, may uplift them, may reform them, may forgive them, may enrich them. That this Spirit of God which now flows through me may be a light unto my neighbor's feet, a blessing, a benediction to all who are in this room. And may I ever come together, this night, tomorrow night, next week, next month, next year, wherever I meet, for the purpose of spiritual enlightenment. May my consciousness be a blessing. May God in me be a blessing and a healing agency and a redemptive influence to all those with whom I am gathered together, and all those who may be touching my consciousness from near or far, be they friend or foe. Still, if they touch my consciousness, if they think of me, let them find in my consciousness an emptiness of self, an emptiness of judgment, criticism, condemnation, an emptiness of fear or hatred or competition. And let them find in my consciousness the fullness of God. God has said, Son, thou art ever with me, and let me feel now, Father, that thou art with me, and that thy presence is a benediction to all who are here. That through my consciousness, thy presence may be felt by all who touch my consciousness. And then you will find that this room is filled with love, with healing grace, with forgiveness, with spiritual uplift, and with the substance of infinite supply. And you never know who will go out of this room and find that for which they are seeking, peace, the peace that passeth understanding, and signs following. Now, as we practice that in this room, in our classwork and our tape recordings, we have made a start, but it is only a start, because now we have another place, and that is our home. And while ordinarily we may believe that our home is the center of love, actually it isn't, because in it there is far too much of an indulgence in criticism, in judgment, in condemnation, in lack of understanding, in lack of cooperation. And therefore we must now turn our home into a temple of God. And we do that in the same way that we do with our classroom or our lecture room. This is my home, Father. This is thy home. For where I am, thou art. And this must be done every day. Every day we must remember that my home is God's home, because the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. And Father, this is thy home. This is thy abiding place. Fill every corner of it with thy presence. Let love reign here, and let me be an instrument through which thy presence finds entrance into this home. My consciousness can only be an instrument for thy presence as my consciousness is devoid of human emotions, negative emotions, negative feelings, negative actions, only in proportion as I resist the human temptation to be uncooperative, to be critical. Only as I resist the temptation to withhold from any member of this household can I block God's entrance into this home. But as I more and more realize that my function in this household is to be the instrument through which God is to find entrance, I must purge my consciousness of its human qualities. I must quickly forgive and quickly forget. I must forgive injustices, forget offenses. I must realize that God neither judges nor condemns, nor must I. I must acknowledge that God's forgiveness is 70 times 7, and so must mine be. I must acknowledge that love can only find entrance into this home through a consciousness devoted to God and to my neighbor. Therefore, not only will I express love, patience, kindness, cooperation in this home, but I will attempt to love my neighbor as myself. My neighbor down the street, my neighbor in the shops, my neighbor in the school, my neighbor in the office, my neighbor. Then does my consciousness become like the consciousness of Jesus Christ. It becomes a transparency through which God's grace enters and blesses the multitudes. Those who are in classrooms must practice this in their classrooms so that the classroom becomes a temple of God. Those who work in the law courts must practice this in the law courts so that a law court becomes a temple of justice, a temple of equity, a temple of love. Regardless of where we live or work, regardless of where we function on the human plane, let us remember that God does not enter except through a consciousness that is a transparency for God, that is willing consciously to let itself be used, that God find entrance. Practice it, sitting in your chair here, to remember, now my consciousness, which has in it nothing but love, no desire for gain, no desire for glory, now, in this uplifted moment, my consciousness is a transparency through which God is flowing into this world. And because God cannot be limited in time or space, because God cannot be limited by walls, the entrance of God into this room is flowing out of this room all up and down the street, and all up and down the nation, and across the waters. Just give God a tiny crack to enter this world and see how quickly that love will encircle the globe, faster than sound, faster than light. But there must be an entrance into this world for God, or else God is kept outside. And you can tell, you know right well, you've read the paper today, 418 deaths on the highways of the United States on the 4th of July. People ostensibly going out for pleasure and becoming the means of death and destruction. Why? Because God wasn't being admitted into their world. Because where the presence of the Lord is, there is fulfillment. Where the Spirit of God is, there is liberty. But you see, it hasn't been taught for centuries that the presence of God and the Spirit of God is only where it is consciously admitted through an activity of your consciousness. Unless you consciously declare, I am an instrument and a transparency through which God's grace blesses mankind, friend and foe. My consciousness does not condemn the sinner. My consciousness does not seek vengeance, but lives for forgiveness. And therefore, through my consciousness of love, God can enter this room, this universe. And then the presence of God becomes a blessing and a bounty. Do you not see that if there are a few of us, it is said that if there are 10 righteous men in a city, the city will be saved. Do you not see that if we have a group in the States and a group in England and a group in Holland and a group in Germany and a group in Switzerland and a group in Africa or Australia, New Zealand, daily opening their consciousness, daily declaring, I am not in this world to get something, to acquire something, to achieve something. I am in this world as an instrument of God. I am here to bear witness to God's presence. I am born only for one reason, that God through me may be made manifest on earth. I am born for the glory of God, not for my personal glory, not for my personal reputation, not for my personal wealth. I am born that God may be glorified. Do you not see then that all of your own good will be added unto you without any conscious effort? You will never have to take thought for your life, what you shall eat or what you shall drink or wherewithal you shall be clothed. That will be done for you as you give your life to living it to show forth God's glory. Never, never will you have to be personal for yourself. Never will it be necessary for you to take thought about your future. Your future will be in God's hands while you are about His business of being a transparency through which God becomes evident on earth as it is in heaven. We talk about the second coming of the Christ. Let's have a first coming here and now. There is only a coming of the Christ when there is a transparency through which it can reach earth. And we cannot be a transparency if our lives are being lived only for our own purposes, just for our own satisfaction, or our own wealth, or our own fame, or our own families. We become a transparency for God when we dedicate ourselves to a love of God and of our neighbor as ourselves. There must be a dedication of our consciousness. And then we need only take 10 minutes at a time, 2 or 3 times at a day, for this realization. Where I am, God is. I bring no condemnation into this world, neither do I condemn thee. Thy sins be forgiven thee. And to every storm, peace, be still. In the name of the Father, peace, be still. That through my love of God and of my neighbor, that love may flow through my consciousness and bless mankind and forgive mankind and uplift mankind and free mankind, my enemy and my friend, that my enemy also may be freed of lust and greed and hate and fear and doubt and atheism, that God's grace may touch their consciousness and awaken their soul. And do you not see that this is the only means whereby God can find entrance to the earth as it is in heaven, to where God's reign can take place on earth as it is in heaven? Our consciousness must be the transparency through which God reaches the earth. We have an example of it in every window. Every window is a transparency through which the light can be permitted to enter what would otherwise be darkness. So every consciousness that is dedicated to the love of God and the love of neighbor becomes a window, becomes a transparency through which the light of truth, the light of love, the light of life enters this world and establishes the reign of God on earth as it is in heaven. A minister told me that one night he had been speaking in a church, and after the talk, a woman in a wheelchair, a crippled woman, came up to him and said, "Oh, I would like to do so much for the world as you have described it. Won't you tell me something that I can do sitting in a wheelchair that would help this great cause?" And this minister said to me, "Do you know what was in my mind at that moment?" And I said, "No." He said, "I was praying, wishing that there'd be a Christian Science practitioner here who could lift this woman up and set her free so that she could do the work she wanted to do." Why was he thinking of a Christian Science practitioner instead of a minister or a priest or a rabbi? Even though he didn't know the reason, beyond the fact that he knew that an understanding practitioner might have healed that woman, what he didn't know, but what he really meant was this: any individual dedicated to God and to man to such an extent that they have given up the personal sense of life becomes a healer. And there is no other way whereby a human being can become a healer except to have a purified consciousness. And so it is that one individual whom he recognized as a Christian Science practitioner, whom we recognize as any practitioner dedicated to God, that only through the consciousness of such an individual can healing come. The going to church regularly and going through all the services and all the rituals and performing them and having all the titles still doesn't admit God as healing consciousness. Only those who have come to a life devoid of a desire for self-will, self-glory, self-riches, self-righteousness, only that state of consciousness becomes the transparency for healing. All other consciousness is just human consciousness, meaning me and mine. I, me and mine. I, me and mine. That's human consciousness, and it is not a healing consciousness. But a healing consciousness is your consciousness or mine in proportion as we give up the personal sense of life and make of our lives a love of God and a love of our neighbor, but remembering that since there is but one God, every man is our neighbor, for every man is our brother. You start to be a healer the very moment you start to consciously be a transparency through which God reaches the earth. The very moment in which you start to practice being a transparency, in that moment you have started the development of your healing consciousness. And when you reach the point that it becomes automatic with you to have in your heart no judgment, no criticism, no condemnation, no thought of self-gain, self-profit, self-righteousness, when you reach that point where even in a measure you are living that kind of an inner life, you'll find that healings take place even without your giving a treatment, just by those around you coming into contact with you and finding that consciousness of love, forgiveness, giving, sharing, cooperating. Now we come back to this world problem. Don't be an ostrich. Don't hide your head in the sand and say there are no problems. And that all is light and all is love. Because you may be indulging in an escape complex. Rather, face this world, face the problems that this world is going through, and be willing to ask yourself, since I know that all of these people, regardless of their goodwill, all of these leaders, are finding it impossible to find a solution, yet I know that where God is, there is no problem. Where God is, there is peace. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. In thy presence is fullness of life and joy. Therefore, I now know the solution to this problem. God's presence must be brought to earth. God's presence must be consciously admitted into this world. A window must be opened. Shades must be lifted so that the light can enter. And since our consciousness is the window, if God is not entering through our consciousness, it is because our consciousness is soiled. And it is only soiled with one kind of dirt, and it spells itself S-E-L-F, self. I, me, or mine. When we begin to clean our consciousness, when we begin to realize less and less of self, more and more of love, more and more of forgiveness, more and more of praise, glory, gratitude, more and more of a willingness for God to touch the consciousness of the sinner, the tyrant, the ignorant, the atheist. If I can open a tiny crack in my consciousness, one tiny little speck of a crack for God to get in, God will so multiply itself over the face of this earth that it will be literally proven that where 10 or more are, where 10 righteous men are, the city will be saved. Just let 10 of us open our souls, open our consciousness. But that means dropping the sense of self, self-righteousness, self-condemnation, self-criticism, Let us accept ourselves as living witnesses to the presence of God. Let us learn literally to take no thought for what we shall eat or drink or wherewithal we shall be clothed. Let us learn to awaken in the morning and, after realizing God's presence, do that which is given us to do, whatever it may be. And do it to the best of our ability and go on to the next thing. Long before we come to the end of the tasks that have been given us, new tasks will be given to us. And with it, recompense, recognition, reward. Not because we seek them, but because they are the added things. We seek nothing but the opportunity to do the work that is given to us to do. If we must write a letter of condolence, let us write it now. If we must write a letter of comfort to someone, let us write it now. If we must write a letter of thanks to someone, let us write it now. If we must speak a word of thanks or praise or gratitude, let us do it now. If there is a cupboard to be cleaned, let us clean it now. If there are some old clothes to be given away, let us give them away now. Let us do each day the task that is given us to do, regardless of how mundane it may appear to be. And if we fulfill that which is given us to do now, we will find that more important things and eventually more spiritual things will be given us to do. But not until we have done that which is already given us to do. And one of those things, always remember, is filling our own consciousness with love, forgiveness, gratitude, praise, loyalty, devotion. Not only to God and King, to our neighbor as to ourselves. You see, the reason that the Master said, "The way is straight and narrow, and few there be that enter," is that people for countless centuries have been taught to expect God to do something. And it can never happen that way. It always is the other way. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. The obligation is always up to ye. Ye must forgive 70 times 7. Ye must forgive the sinner. Ye must pray for the enemy. Ye must know the truth. Ye must do this and ye must do that. And that's why so few enter. It's so much easier to sit back and say, God will do it, or God is doing it, or God ought to do it, but there is none. There is none. It is we who must make ourselves a transparency through which God may enter the scene. And we have to do that within ourselves. Physician, heal thyself. And we who would be physicians to the world, spiritual ministers to the world, we must heal ourselves, cleanse ourselves, minister unto ourselves, until our consciousness is purged of self, and we can be a transparency through which God's grace reaches the earth.